recent commentary where we made some analysis between the parallels of what's recently happened within the context of the pandemic and COVID-19 over the past couple of years, and some of the cultural and media elements that are similar with the way in which the war in Ukraine is being presented. I'm delighted to be joined by Piers Robinson, who has just published a paper with Panda titled From COVID-19 to Ukraine, Bouncing from One Crisis to the Next, and the Importance of Staying Focused, where he touched upon some of these very issues that we spoke about last Friday. Now, Piers has a rich history in political science, communications, propaganda. He's the co-director of the Organization of Propaganda Studies, former academic of politics and society and political journalism at the University of Sheffield. He's spent a large part of his career analyzing some of the very subjects that we're going to be speaking about today. And we're going to be talking about some of these parallels in more depth, looking at the concept of propaganda, how it's been utilized over the last couple of years and how it is used within wartime, and what some of these issues may be disguising and what they may be enabling to happen within our domestic and global political, social, and cultural agendas. So, Piers, it's an absolute pleasure to have you here for this important conversation. Welcome to the Pandemic Podcast.
Thank you. It's good to be with you, Dan.
So, there is some I mean, they're obviously very different. War and pandemics on paper are very different situations, but we know that throughout the pandemic, certainly in Britain, Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, was kind of positioning himself in this kind of warlike footing, and even warlike terms were used from the outset, from the early introduction of the lockdowns. Perhaps Boris was trying to have his Churchill moments, but the language used throughout the pandemic and what's obviously being used to describe an actual war now have been very similar. What has been your initial reaction, I suppose, or response to seeing how the media and the way that the public have responded to COVID-19 to now what we're seeing in Ukraine? Were you able to draw an immediate parallel? Is this something that raised alarm bells for you once you started to pay attention to what was happening?
Well, I mean, even before we get to the issue of okay, what are we seeing in the case of the Ukraine and what did we see in the case of COVID and the parallels? I mean, it's worth just summarizing what the scholarly literature tells us about media in wartime. And then there's a big literature on this, and it's perhaps not surprising to many people what the conclusions are, but it's worth spelling them out. We know that wartime situations are accompanied by very, very high levels of propaganda, very concerted, deliberate attempts by authorities to control the narrative. And we know that in wartime, it's extremely difficult to voice dissent without being accused of being a traitor or sort of siding with the enemy. So it's a very hostile environment to open debate. Authorities engage in a very high level of propaganda. And we know sort of from the broader literature, which looks at earlier conflicts, it could be Vietnam or the First and the Second World War, we know that the consequence of these dynamics of the pressure on dissent or the suppression of dissent combined with the propaganda from authorities is that you nearly always have incredibly one-sided understandings being promoted by authorities and mainstream media in conflict situations. Normally reduced to a very simplistic good versus evil. Obviously, you're on the side of good, the enemy is the evil. And any kind of context or explanatory or nuanced explanatory framework tends to be pushed to one side. So you have a clear aggressor and clear victim narrative being articulated. And combined with all that is this kind of heightened emotion of people's feelings. People are mobilized in a very powerful way in wartime. Historically, that's been by sentiments of nationalism and patriotism, wanting to support your forces and your troops in wartime. And you actually sort of see even in the case of the 2003 Iraq invasion, when, of course, you had a lot of public opposition to it. But once the war started, most people sort of got into line and supported troops. So you have natural patriotism at work. But you've also had in the last 25 years in the West a different kind of emotional mobilizer, and that's the humanitarian narrative. And this emerged in the 1990s. This is my early doctoral work, was on the CNN effect and the drive from the media to intervene in humanitarian crises. And that kind of sort of moral imperative is carried on in the narratives and propaganda promoted by Western governments. So even, say, going back to the invasion of Iraq in 2003, that there was the weapons of mass destruction argument being made, but at the same time it was being promoted as we're bringing democracy to Iraq, we're here to remove an evil dictator. It's a humanitarian intervention in a way. And that's continued, and I think, you know, that can be a powerful mobilizing force of people, and possibly what we're seeing in the case of Ukraine at the moment. But what that tends to do is that it seizes people's emotions, that they adhere to the narratives which are being promoted to them through propaganda, and it becomes, you know, a powerful tool of mobilization. Wars mobilize publics, and they bring publics together, or potentially at least. And I think some historians have probably argued that conflicts in the 20th century, you know, there are ones which you can point to and say, well, was this a calculation in the leaders' decision-making to go to war, that it was about trying to solidify support at home? And if I remember correctly, when Argentina invaded the Falklands back in the early 1980s, I think one of the arguments I saw floating around at the time was that Galtieri had done it primarily to shore up his public support at home, so it would be a popular thing to do. So, you know, that's something to keep in mind, certainly in the case of Ukraine. But that's the scholarly take on how the media operate in wartime. It's, you know, official narratives, high level of propaganda, media falling in line, heightened emotions, lack of dissent, lack of open debate going on. And that's what we know historically.
So, Piers, if I may, you know, it's interesting to draw that contrast with Iraq and other wars. I listened to a podcast this week from 2019 that looked at those political influences, and it's. I think the biggest thing here to recognize that in war, you know, there are always winners and losers, and that isn't exclusive to the nations that are fighting. And perhaps we can talk about those influences later on. But you yourself, as someone who's studied propaganda, you've had your fair share on the you've been on the receiving end through your work at looking at this previously. Could you just tell us a little bit about, you know, your academic work in this field and how you've been affected just by virtue of studying this?
Well, my background academic work was looking initially at media and impact on foreign policy making, and then really from the Iraq invasion onwards, I was looking at media coverage of war, analyzing media coverage, looking at the biases that operated. And then after that, in about 2010 onwards, I started to look more closely at propaganda, because I started to understand as an academic that, you know, we can sit and criticize the media as much as we want, but we're actually missing out on a much bigger process which goes on behind the scenes, and those are propaganda activities. And I was first my interest was piqued in this, looking at the run up to the invasion of Iraq and the intelligence that was used to justify that invasion. And one of the things that I was looking at, and these were the documents which were coming out showing what had been going on within the British government. Some of it flowed from the BBC Gilligan, David Kelly issue. But the documents coming out showed really how extensive the planning was in relation to the propaganda in relation to Iraq. And so I started to understand that this is really what we should be focusing upon as academics. We shouldn't just be looking at the media. We shouldn't just be looking at public opinion. We should actually be looking at the places where information is in the first instance manipulated and manufactured, as it were. And that led me to, I looked at Iraq, I published some papers on that, and then I started to look more closely at the global war on terror, because one of the issues which came out in relation to global war on terror from the Chilcot inquiry, which was, of course, the investigation of the British involvement in the Iraq war, was that a lot of the planning on Iraq was already going on between Bush and Blair in that case, immediately after 9/11. And there was a clear drive towards a regime change strategy at that point. And that was quite a remarkable thing to come out from the Chilcot inquiry, that the wars we've been living through for the last 20 years, there's a higher element of planning than perhaps the public was aware of. And so carried on looking at propaganda, started looking at Syria, and I think that was when things really started to become very interesting, because I started looking at the war in Syria as a natural thing for somebody who'd finished looking at Iraq. I look at the Syrian conflict, look at propaganda. And of course, I suppose the problem with looking at Syria was that it's an ongoing war, still ongoing, and an ongoing propaganda campaign. And almost immediately that I started looking with a number of other academics at the issue of Syria, we started to be attacked ferociously and smeared. And just to give just one very quick example of this was we set up a working group to look at Syria and media and propaganda. And before we'd actually really published any substantive papers on Syria, on the work group website, we found ourselves on the front page of the Times newspaper. And this was after an alleged chemical weapons attack in Douma in Syria, and before France, Britain, and America bombed Syria in retaliation. A controversy which I still examine and look at today. We found ourselves on the front page of the Times being accused of conspiracy theorists, Putin apologists, and so war crimes deniers. Front page of the Times, there was an editorial essentially asking for us to be fired to all intent and purpose, and a couple of other articles in there with pictures as well. It's absolutely extraordinary that a small group of pretty unknown academics, researchers, doing what they're sort of supposed to do as academics and researchers, should find themselves on the receiving end of an attack of that scale. And it hasn't stopped since then. It's been a rolling sort of thunder of attacks over the years, really primarily rooted, I think, because the work we'd done was treading all over the toes of a current conflict and a current propaganda operation. And those attacks and that kind of the smearing of people, the kind of the shutting down of dissent. You've got people talking about issues you don't want them to talk about. That's I think my own experience is an interesting case study for anyone to look at. But it shows us what we have been seeing in relation to COVID-19. I think that this kind of overall tactic of suppressing questions and smearing people, trying to destroy their academic reputations or whatever reputation, we saw that very, very clearly with COVID-19. And we saw this early on in the COVID-19 event, as I tend to refer to it now, where you had scientists coming out saying, well, wait a minute, maybe lockdown will do more harm than good. And these scientists were smeared very, very heavily. And even there was cooperation between the tech giants, YouTube and Facebook, with the authorities in order to remove some of these people. And I suppose the most high-profile example of this that we have quite well documented now was Fauci and was it Hill in America issuing or discussing getting a takedown, an aggressive takedown of the Great Barrington Declaration, which of course had been signed by a very large number of scientists saying that, look, lockdown will do more harm than good. We should engage in focused protection. Sunetra Gupta from Oxford, obviously, Bhattacharya and Martin Kulldorff were the lead epidemiologists, eminent, renowned, very well respected. And there you had, in that case, you had Fauci and you had Hill from the National Institute of Health in America, just almost casually becoming aware of the Great Barrington Declaration and then discussing how to take it down, not take it down through an open scientific debate, but to take it down by smearing, by discrediting. And this we've seen again and again with COVID-19. It's actually the same tactic. It's a tactic of smear. It's a tactic of character assassination. It's actually a public relations tactic. Public relations, some people would say, well, it's propaganda. But that's what we have seen. And so the kind of going back to your sort of initiating question for this, that what we see in wartime propaganda, suppression of dissent, smear campaigns against people questioning authorities. Well, that wartime mode it seems to have been seamlessly blended with what we've seen with COVID-19. You talked about politicians describing it in terms of a war. Well, it seems that the techniques that we used in terms of controlling the information environment were essentially wartime style techniques being used. With, as I'm sure you and many of your viewers would agree, with pretty devastating consequences in the case of COVID-19 for the public, to the extent that one agrees, and there does seem to be an emerging consensus, an emerging body of opinion that lockdowns did more harm than good, that mass injection and so on is not the right thing to do, and all of the issues circulating around that. That suppression of dissent was very bad. If it hadn't been occurring, there might have been an opportunity perhaps for more rational responses to what was going on. Rational, whether it be the Great Barrington Declaration or any other response which didn't involve quite extraordinary interference and suppression of normal life for many, many people. So yeah, it was a war footing, and we certainly seem to be in that territory again now with Ukraine. So all of these arguments I've set out, I think, seem to be very applicable to what we're seeing with the Ukraine situation. As it develops and as it rolls on, as I said before the interview, I mean, there's a worrying escalation beyond current situation, which seems to be, according to some commentators, pushing us towards an ever closer conflict with Russia. And this is obviously very worrying.
Yes. Whilst in terms of its media coverage, it feels like it's still relatively early, but that, 0 to 100 has been reached incredibly fast in terms of its amplification. And of course, at least from my perspective, nothing, when we talk about these elements, it doesn't take away from the fact that we are seeing footage of people being killed and the scenes of war taking place, but we have also got a blur, with some of these parallels that are already. And the difficult thing I find about this, Piers, is that just by mentioning some of the things are parallels, leads people to say you're a war minimizer. You're minimizing what's going on. I'm not minimizing what's going on, but we do know, as with COVID, we've seen already fake imagery, fake videos emerging about what's happening in Ukraine. We saw that repeatedly throughout COVID. There was a piece of footage from a hospital in 2017 in Paris that was used in multiple countries around the world to depict the stresses that hospitals were under. It had nothing to do with COVID. We're now seeing video clips of Ukraine and Russia that are fabricated or from movie scenes, quite frankly. And this doesn't take away from the fact that there are real scenes happening. But my perspective is to lift the lid of trust in the media perception, because how can we truly make sense of what's happening there? You and I talked before we went live to say, the media is presenting this as this existential threat to, potential nuclear disaster, World War III. It's got to that point incredibly fast. Yeah, we really do have no real clue, based upon the lack of trust now in media, to present the realities as they are, which to me is one of the most concerning parallels that we find here between COVID and Ukraine. What's your interpretation of what we're seeing? And could you elaborate a little bit more on some of the techniques that you see being similar between what we've witnessed over the last couple of years and now very early on within this the context of the conflict?
Well, I think the most immediate concern that strikes me, and this was one of the concerns which struck me in relation to COVID-19, because in relation to COVID-19, I think, although I wrote an article warning people that these are situations where elites can exploit emotion to do things other than what they're claiming to do. I wrote a warning about that, but I was quite cautious to begin with. I thought, well, it's not totally clear what is going on. But what really became alarming was the censorship and the suppression of people. Because what I thought is, as soon as you have that, the first thing that anyone should be asking is, okay, why does there have to be this suppression of dissent and censorship going on? It's always an indicator that authorities are not confident in the validity of the narrative that they're promoting. It's an indication that they are fully aware that unless they do censor and suppress, they will just lose people's support. And so it's always a big warning sign. And of course, we have that very clearly with the Ukraine situation. We've had obviously the removal of RT, the Russian linked broadcasters and so on. But you've also seen censorship again, as I was talking about in terms of my own experience, but also in relation to COVID-19. I've seen already censorship or rather smearing of academics. And so John Mearsheimer, a very eminent American international relations scholar who, has been pointing out the argument that Russia has a security interest which it was going to react to at some point, which was the eastward shift of NATO towards its borders. I saw him being smeared by an American journalist as being sort of, this is the Putin narrative or something along those lines. And that to me is the first warning sign which I think people should heed, that if there's that kind of smearing and suppression of discussion going on and debate, then we have to be very concerned about whether we're getting the full picture. We should always be concerned about that in wartime or in relation to any other issue, but particularly so when there's very high levels of censorship. I think people's the good default position to have is that the situation is probably more black and white than the way it is being. Is more nuanced than the way it's being presented to us, and it's time to think and to think carefully and to spend time to try and search around, look for alternative, independent, non-corporate media information, non-government information, and start to use your own intelligence. Just as we did see at the beginning of COVID-19, some people, despite the ferocity of the propaganda, some people did say, wait a minute, Peter Hitchens, for example, from the Mail on Sunday, was an early voice questioning what was going on, using his own intelligence. And I think that's my biggest take home at the moment from what we're seeing with Ukraine is that clearly there's suppression of information, and that's a very big warning sign that we're not getting the full picture, and we might, if this situation continues to develop, and if it develops into a more protracted conflict, for example, we're likely to see more and more of this, and we're going to see a greater and greater danger that populations on both sides in Russia and also in Europe will become increasingly polarized, not have the ability to see what's going on from the point of view of the other side, not, as Robert McNamara said, to sort of to see or learn to see yourself as your enemy would see, to understand how you are perceived. All of those attempts to try and think more critically and in a more nuanced way start to get lost when we get mobilized into these two camps. And I guess that's one of the alarming things. That's the most alarming thing about what I'm seeing at the moment, is that there is clearly a drive by authorities to encourage people to see the conflict in a very particular way. And I guess what I'm hinting at there is that I'm somewhat worried about how far authorities are willing to take this in terms of fueling conflict, making a conflict worse than it already is, and how that might play back in certainly in terms of the European Union, but the West in general. And we already have people talking about the possibility of blocs emerging at the geopolitical level: China, Russia, India versus the West. These are not good things to be seeing. We're at a point in the international system where there have been these shifts in the balance of power, and they seem, I'm not saying that they are, but they seem that might be developing quite rapidly. And there is always a lot of dangers associated with that. And that's before we get to this issue which I think you want to talk about, is back in relation to COVID-19. But, people need to be very alert to this, and very alert to how countries can be taken to places of conflict through propagandized populations. Just as we've seen with COVID, populations can be taken to extraordinary places in terms of lockdown, suppression of civil rights, mandating injections on entire populations, extraordinary measures, which I'm sure you and I never thought we would ever see in our lifetimes. This is the real danger. We get taken to places which are bad and destructive when we're unable to think for ourselves and unable to develop sort of a more rational, reasoned assessments of what's happening and what should be done, right? Because it's about trying to think what is the best, most rational course of action in this situation, rather than sort of beating the drums of war.
Yes, I mean it's very difficult. I find the whole situation very difficult and it feels slippery even to it feels like there's multiple banana skins just even addressing it, because for myself personally, when I began to address the issues with COVID-19, it had already reached a point where it's highly emotionalized, and of course it's going to be emotionalized because it's a matter of life and death for some. But what led me to taking a stand and actually starting this show was the fact that the gap between what the data and the science was showing, plus my own lived experience, was so increasingly removed from the perception that was being created within the media and within government. And again, I always feel like I have to put the asterisks to say that just by saying that doesn't mean that there wasn't a serious issue for some. It just, in the world we live in, we have to say that, otherwise someone's going to say, you're a denier, blah blah blah. It's just ridiculous. But nonetheless, I do understand. I can see both sides, but at the same time, it's that overinflation, that sensationalism, that fatalism that we were witnessing in the media. And I feel myself, and I was nervous to approach it at that point because of the sensitivities. And I'm even more nervous to approach it with these sensitivities, because there is a difference between a virus that is of nature, or well, that's a whole different discussion whether it is of nature or whether it's helped along by a lab incident. But warfare is very much a human creation. It's and the consequences of war are also a matter of life and death. So I'm very careful in what I'm saying, and but what I am saying is I have no idea what's happening. It's very comfortable for me to sit here in an office in Bristol and speak about something that's happening in a different part of the world, where there are literally guns being fired and bombs being exploded, etc. But at the same time, I have what I feel is a healthy skepticism over how the media is portraying this, particularly in the context of what has happened in the last 2 years, where we have now seen a revisionist, approach within the media, going back and actually saying, well, these things, the John Hopkins study around lockdowns showing that the lockdowns have caused more harm, everything that the dissenting voices were saying. And I always warned throughout the entire period that the media is creating a boy cried wolf situation, where one day there may be something that happens that requires people to take seriously, but they no longer will. There's the film that DiCaprio recently put out, which I found was fascinating around these subjects, Don't Look Up. But to me, that was eminently linked to this. It's now that people's distrust in media is so great that I quite frankly don't really, I don't know I can believe anything that's said about Russia and Ukraine, and whether the dissenting voices now that are being smeared are the ones that are closer to the actual reality of the situation. But for the public, Piers, who are watching this, how do they make sense of what's how does one navigate propaganda? And because 2 years ago, prior to the pandemic, quite frankly, I've always had a healthy distrust of authority, I feel, but I'd never questioned things in the scale that I have now. But I think many people just still see what they see on the television and believe that's what it is, as it is.
Well, it's tough for the public, or it's tough for people, especially people who have historically in their lifetime trusted, as it were, the BBC to be telling them the truth, and a lot more people realize now that that's not the case. And it is difficult. I mean, I think one of the things that people can do in relation to this is that, first of all, as you say, it is difficult to find out and to have confidence in what's going on. So the first sort of logical thing to do in relation to that is to don't jump on a particular bandwagon. Yes. Think before you jump, and use your own sort of skills of critical thinking as much as you can. So that's really important, that people sort of keep that sort of stance in relation to this. I think what people need to do in relation to what we're seeing. So I was just going to move because I'm getting the sun starting to yes, come into me a little bit. So I'll just completely. Actually, we go. There we go. Watching in the background. That the first thing I think that people need to think. Going back to your point about what is really going on, and these people think, well, how can you believe anything that you're seeing in the mainstream media? I mean, one of the points I made when COVID-19 occurred back in March 2020 is this idea that elites and governments and authorities will instrumentalize or take advantage of crises and situations in order to further political aims and objectives. And the reason why I said this in relation to COVID-19 back in March, I think it was, when I wrote a piece for Off Guardian, was that this was based upon what we'd seen with a global war on terror. That we'd had this apparently disparate conflicts occurring, and then it had become apparent that actually there was far more sort of intentionality and coordination going on in relation to instigating wars and conflicts as part of a much broader geopolitical agenda. So people sort of were kind of presented the image, we're fighting Islamic fundamentalist terrorism, when really the driving force was geopolitical regime change wars. And so you had trying to remove Saddam Hussein, even though he had nothing to do with Al-Qaeda and so on. So they had a very clear example of political elites, in that case, the US and the British governments, using the event of 9/11 in order to initiate and promote an agenda which was not really to do with terrorism, it was more to do with geopolitical objectives. And the same goes for COVID. I was saying we need to be very careful about how this might be used, because we know that this is what political elites do. It's how they get things done. People get mobilized around a particular issue, and then you use that to push forward on other fronts. And I think that's what people need to keep in mind in relation to the Ukraine. And this is where there are clear links, I think, with COVID-19. And this comes to the issue of what people were increasingly beginning to become aware of in relation to COVID-19. So there's not only been this awareness that, say, lockdown isn't effective and that the injections are not what they have been presented in terms of their efficacy and so on. Not just sort of awareness of that, there's also been awareness that there have been political and economic agendas which have been pushed forward. And of course, most visibly, we saw this in the early days of COVID-19, with the Great Reset and the World Economic Forum and the talk of digitized society and all of these visions of the future. And then I think a little bit further into the COVID crisis, other people started to become aware of issues surrounding the economy. And of course, this is one of the arguments that has been made by some analysts, that you had a major financial crisis emerging in the repo markets in 2019. And you have a financial system which is very profoundly broken. And you have solutions floating there as to how to take things forward. And this is where these arguments that we've seen, not so much in the mainstream, but they were beginning to get into the mainstream, that central bank digital currency, programmable digital ID, vaccine passports, mandates, all of these things create a kind of infrastructure which gives a lot of power to authorities and a lot of power to control. And of course, you've had these arguments about, the idea this is similar to the Chinese social credit system, which you see in one or two provinces in China. And awareness of those are underlying political agendas which have been pushed forward very much under the cover, one could say, of COVID-19, as people have been laser focused on the virus and how to deal with it. We've seen that rolling out. Now, of course, some people, it's easy for people to say, well, that's a conspiracy theory, but you're not really talking necessarily about a grand conspiracy. You're talking about political actors taking advantage of circumstances to push forward on agendas. And I think that sort of that's where we are at in terms of understanding COVID-19, is that there's been much more going on. People were becoming increasingly aware of that. I see although things such as mandates seem to be dropping, and there's obviously this crisis over the virus narrative because of what we've seen in the last few months and the issues beginning to emerge about the injection itself and so on, and the potential harm that it causes. You've had all of that sort of uncertainty emerging, but you still have this drive. You see the World Health Organization trying to develop this treaties to basically override the sovereignty of nations. They declare a pandemic and then they can require people to, for example, lock down. We see that moving ahead. We still see the chatter about central bank digital currencies, and we still have the financial crisis. And now with Ukraine, we have potentially major structural transformations in the economy because of this disentangling, it seems to be occurring at the moment, between Russia and Europe, which is going to have huge impact on our societies. And one can easily envisage how the kind of agendas we were starting to understand that were being pushed forward in relation to COVID-19 can be carried on under the guise of the Ukraine conflict, where that pulls attention away from these underlying changes which are occurring, stops people scrutinizing it, stops people protesting against it. Look at the scale of protests and opposition we've seen emerging, and we saw it crystallized in Canada, I guess, with the truckers, trucker campaign in Ottawa in the last few weeks. An awful lot of awareness and pushing back and understanding that, right, there's a lot going on and people need to get mobilized. A war, and a war which gets even bigger than the one we're seeing at the moment, is going to be a powerful way of distracting people from that. And I think that's the warning that we should be taking on board at the moment. It's not a crazy conspiracy theory anymore to talk about the World Economic Forum. That they've been very clear about their political agenda. It's not a crazy conspiracy theory to talk about central bank digital currency, because they talk about it in the open, and it's clear they're pushing for that. And the warning that some analysts make that these changes will have a profound impact on our democracies, a concentration of power, potentially arguably to effectively end democracy, end our sort of notion of ourselves as individuals in a society who have rights and a degree of autonomy, that can potentially be lost. And a war situation in Ukraine makes me simply have to reiterate that warning that this could be the next big distraction. It's not that it's not real, it's not that it's not serious, but it's an event which can be exploited and used. And I think that's the kind of sort of take-home political science, social science lesson for everyone, which they need to just keep in mind. They don't have to take a side. They don't have to be sure that they know exactly what's going on, but they just need to be extremely alert, as any person does in a democracy, to the fact that big events get used and exploited. 9/11 has led to 20 years of war and wars which carry on. That's a third of my lifetime. These are huge sort of structural deep events, as Peter Dale Scott describes, and it's certainly the case of COVID-19, and I very possibly of Ukraine situation, that's going to be, as it were, the next event to enable these things to be pushed forward. So we need to keep our eyes open, and that's the warning that I think we should take, and perhaps that's as much as people can take on board at the moment, because we are being confronted with a lot. People are scared. I bet a lot of people in the authorities know that, and so on, and this idea of exploitation of people's fear. But we can at least sit and say, well, okay, let's try to think and try to understand better what might be going on, and then to respond to that, as people have done with COVID-19. Is that, I've been very impressed at the range and scale of organizations, protests which have emerged from the grassroots primarily, where people could see through the propaganda in relation to COVID. They could see that their right to protest was being threatened, their civil rights, their democratic rights were potentially at risk. Their livelihoods, of course, not, the huge impact of lockdowns has been this impact upon the working class. A lot of people have been able to realize that and to take action. And I think that kind of sort of nascent emergence of mobilized, politically aware people doesn't matter. It's not a left or right issue. I think it's important to keep that momentum going, and also to start to understand the Ukraine in terms of how it might be used, and then to keep carrying on with what we have been doing, which is getting a better sense of what's going on, people taking action in terms of protests or joining organizations, parties, and so on. That's really important that people do that now. But they can do that without having to be absolutely sure. I've worked it all out. I know exactly what's going on. You can just be aware of the dangers. I think that's the issue. It's the clear and present danger there is to our societies with what we've seen over COVID-19 and now Ukraine. And then to use our intelligence and keep pushing forward, to hold the line, as it were, this kind of line which has emerged in the last 2 years, with people saying, well, we don't trust what the government's doing. We are aware that there are sort of networks between corporations and international organizations which do not look in any way appropriate, and we've all been locked down. We're being told we have to have an injection in order to be able to go shopping in some countries. People are right to be aware of that and alert to that, but just to keep that frame of mind in place, I think, as we go through the coming weeks.
It's very, thank you, Piers. I mean, it's so, everything you've outlined is very complex, but at the same time, so simple, because one of the early distinctions I made, just looking to the history books, is that it's clear that almost every conflict in history or crisis has been utilized. There are people who will take the opportunity to advance, as you said, whether that's political, economic, technological, social aims, because for the simple, there are multiple reasons for that, but the simple reality is, as we've witnessed in COVID-19, the political process in the United Kingdom was entirely focused on COVID. I remember speaking to my MP I had a telephone call with him, and his usual priorities were taking a back seat to being involved in the discussions around COVID-19. So all of the usual checks and balances and scrutiny, as we witnessed quite clearly, everyone could see that. It's public. It was clear. You had to be asleep to not witness that the parliamentary process, the usual democratic processes, had fallen flat. MPs in the House of Commons, when it came to the last debate around the Coronavirus Act last year, the renewal date, the MPs were saying how frustrated they were with this, the lack of democracy in our. So inevitably, we see legislation pass that wouldn't normally pass without due scrutiny. But we see innovation. There was some first new applications of CRISPR gene editing technology that again wouldn't normally get approved under normal circumstances, but under the guise of a crisis, we see these things accelerating in ways that they wouldn't normally. And what we've got now is bouncing from one crisis to the next. We've literally, and there are, even within the mainstream media, there are memes mocking their own shift in attention. The shift in attention from overnight COVID to Ukraine. There are even mainstream, the media sources themselves are even mocking how ridiculous it is that we've gone from one thing overnight to the next, like cartridge it, want COVID off, war on. But as a result, that is now going to continue. And just in our domestic shores here in the United Kingdom, the human rights public consultation just closed yesterday evening. We've got the police bill coming up. They've got the judiciary. There's all kinds of bills coming up that just quite simply will not get the same scrutiny they would do in the absence of war. And this is not constrained to the United Kingdom. And this is just purely the political process, let alone the economic, the social, the technological. And, conflict is the land of opportunity. It is, for the opportunist. But in the absence of scrutiny and the morals and ethics, anything can happen. And my worry, Piers, is this. For myself personally, there's a process that people go through. In my 20s, I was just getting on with my life. I was trying to build my career. I was trying to do my thing. I didn't really pay much attention, naively, to what was happening in the world around me, politically, economically, socially, technologically. The only technology I was aware of is the latest iPhone. But then even when I did pay more attention, the next barrier comes up is some of the barriers we talked about today, is what can you trust? And at that initial point, I didn't have the distrust because I hadn't taken the time to actually scrutinize. So it actually not only takes becoming aware of the political environment, the social environment, cultural environment we're living in, the technological environment, to even care, but then secondly, to even understand where to look to get reliable information. So take something like you've mentioned, the central banking digital currencies. Unless you've taken the time to scrutinize to understand what's happening in the financial markets and the economy and the consequences of something like this for one's liberty, and even have an awareness of what that means for your future privacy and ability to make economic choices and to retain liberty from the state in terms of your activities. There's a lot to go through to get to that point of understanding, because you're absolutely right. Nothing we've talked about today is conspiracy. It's also true. It's also a fact that many of the things you're talking about were pre-existing pre-pandemic, but we've just seen it come to the limelight. And where it starts to get labeled as conspiracy is many of these things are kind of like a boiling frog. The technology is being developed. The economic systems are being refined and looked at. But it's when it comes under a crisis like that, and then you suddenly get a lot of attention on something out of nowhere, people think, oh, it must be a conspiracy because all of a sudden there's this attention, even though it's been bubbling away in the background. But it's not. It's a reality. So it's such a complex equation. And to be able to navigate, and I want to close on this, Piers, because the final piece that makes it very complicated is how our perceptions of reality are shaped by not only traditional media or legacy media, but the modern social media, digital media, algorithms, big data. Our perception of reality is what determines our reality. But our perception is being shaped for us unless we come back to that point of awareness. And in the context of propaganda, if we haven't become aware of the fact that propaganda even exists and it's playing a role in our, advertising is technically a form of propaganda. So if you haven't got to that point of awareness, I agree with you. It's great that there's resistance, but my concern is that we've got, the technocratic legacy, the technocratic movement has been going since the early 1900s. That's been bubbling along. But here we are now in the face of another crisis with these things accelerating. And we've got that overlaid with digital technology. I do hold out hope, but how do we punctuate? How do we break the cycle? What is your background in understanding propaganda? How do we break free? How do we ultimately break free from that? How do we reclaim our power so we can break through from the influences of propaganda?
Well, in the first instance, I think understanding that propaganda is there is a really important step, and I think you saw this with Laura Dodsworth's State of Fear,
yes.
and
Yes.
which crystallized for a lot of people. There's propaganda going on because as some scholars of propaganda point out, sort of we learn that propaganda happens over there or in wartime, but not here in nice, warm, cuddly democracy. But recognizing that actually propaganda is a major part of the world we're in is a very important first intellectual step. And then that allows you to not take at face value what you're seeing, especially from big, powerful broadcasters such as the BBC or the Times newspaper, that sort of propaganda will be filtered through those. So that allows you to at least step to one side and to start to think for yourself. I think the step from there on, and I think this is a hard lesson, but maybe it's too much for this interview, but I think the reality of COVID-19 and what we have learned and what we are learning right now about things such as the injection and the lockdowns that's a pretty major failure of our institutions, academic, media, political system as well, our parliamentarians, that these policies were able to be enacted without any resistance, significant resistance, is a clear indication to everyone that we have our political systems are broken in a very significant way. And what the unwelcome place that takes us to, but I think it's an inevitable one, is that we have to recognize that we're in tough times. We are in a point in history where there are major changes going on. There are real threats to our livelihoods and to our future and to our democracies. And this is a time where people just have to make the effort to read around, to get engaged, to talk to people, to think for themselves. And it's going to be hard work. If the system is as broken as I'm suggesting it is, and I'm saying that what we've seen with COVID-19 should be the final nail in the coffin, it's not working properly, because that should never, all those things should never have happened over the last 2 years. If academia, if media, if parliamentarians had actually been standing up and scrutinizing what was going on, okay? Then that, if the system's broken, it means no one's going to come and save us. Okay, we're not going to have a knight in shining armor coming and rescuing us from Parliament or the mainstream media. This requires people to start to mobilize, to organize, as has already been happening, as we've seen. The work that you do, for example, these are all good examples of people waking up to what's going on. But this is going to be tough. This is going to take a lot of work and engagement for all of us. I have no doubt the remainder of my life will be taken up sort of trying to help people rebuild our institutions. I'm not really particularly into we got to sort of, as it were, change a completely new system. We just need to rebuild or restore what we already had, or restore the system to the point that it's working in the way that it's supposed to be working. This is just going to be a huge effort. But that's the scale of the situation we're in. The alternative, as I'm sure perhaps you and perhaps some of your viewers realize, the alternative is that we go into a very negative future for ourselves and for our children in terms of loss of democracy. So we're in a political struggle, and it's I know that everyone has a lot of there's going to be economic problems that we're seeing, which are getting worse and worse. These are all things which take up people's time, but it is necessary that people also think, right, what can we do? How can I help? How can I organize? How can we work with other people from across, really from across the political spectrum, right? This is not a left-right issue, in order to try and sort of help to build a better future, or build back on our terms. I think that's the way I would end it on. Build back a society on our terms, on democratic terms, which are not ultimately what I suspect what we have at the moment is an attempt to restructure on the terms of very powerful, very affluent elements in our societies. It's going to be hard work and it's going to be scary, but we're in that point in history, and it's down to us to try and do what we can.
Indeed it is. Well, Piers, thank you so much for your insights and your experience here on the Pandemic Podcast today. I think the key takeaway for me on this is that we must remain focused, we must remain vigilant, but ultimately we must take the power in our hands to shape the future that we want to create. That for me is the fundamental decision that I've made, like yourself. I can see the rest of my lifetime now being based around how can I transform, help transform individuals so that they become empowered and actually feel like they're an active participant in change. But then more broadly from that, how do we start to transform and iterate the systems of power that we are dealing with by having these transformational leaders looking at how we can create a better future to come, which is grounded upon those solid values, I think, which have been lost of, freedom, peace, truth, and so on. So for those of our audience who are interested in being part of that discussion, we've recently launched the Elevate Network, where we've built a platform for these types of discussions about how we move forward from COVID-19 in the wake of what we've witnessed and start to transform the world around us. If that's a conversation you'd like to be part of, please visit weareelevate.org. I also want to take the opportunity to give a shout out for Panda. Piers, we haven't spoken about Panda here today, but Piers is involved with Panda organization. We've seen Nick Hudson on the show 3 times. The paper that Piers briefly referenced today, from COVID-19 to Ukraine, bouncing from one crisis to the next, and the importance of staying focused, is now available on the Panda website. You can get that at pandata.org. It's really important that we continue to move forward. So Piers, it's been a real pleasure interviewing you today. Thank you so much for your time and expertise, and thank you to our audience for tuning in to this wonderful episode.